Hi, everyone. Welcome. Great to see so many people have joined us here. For those of you who are just trickling in, please feel free to use the chat function to introduce yourselves. And yeah, I think we'd really like to leave as much time as possible for questions. So I think I might just jump right in as people join us. So, hi there. My name is Adrienne, and I work at ICLEI Canada, and I do communications for Climate Insight. I'm here today with some other panelists who you will be introduced to as we go. And I will be moderating our Q&A and also the chat and Q&A function. So please feel free to use those throughout the webinar. I'd like to start by just setting the stage a little bit today by acknowledging that reconciliation is a fundamental component to building equitable, net zero, and resilient communities, which is what Climate Insight aims to do. ICLEI Canada's work, including Climate Insight, happens across Turtle Island, which has traditionally been and is home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples since time immemorial. Our team on this call are joining from all over, all different regions. But I, for one, am calling in from Toronto on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And Toronto is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. And I also want to acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. Throughout our work at ICLEI Canada, we are committed to strengthening relationships with Indigenous groups and knowledge keepers, knowing that reconciliation requires ongoing learning, unlearning, reflection, and action. We endeavor to listen to and learn from Indigenous peoples on an ongoing basis in the process of our work. And since Climate Insight does cover so many areas, really the entire country, please feel free as you're introducing yourselves in the chat, should you wish to do so, to also, acknowledge the land that you're on. Now that we've set the stage to ground ourselves in where we're speaking, I'd like to really quickly set the stage for what we're talking about, which is the Climate Insight platform. So to start us off, I'm going to launch a quick poll. Let's see. And this is just two very short questions that should hopefully have appeared on your screen to help us get an idea of how familiar folks on the call are with the Climate Insight platform. The majority of this webinar is going to be answering your questions and speaking to you about the platform. So this will just give us an idea of where people are coming into this conversation. So I see so far, actually, more than half of respondents so far are brand new to Climate Insight. So it's quite exciting. Thank you for being with us. It's exciting to hear that you found out about our webinar and you're keen to learn more. Yeah, this is very interesting. And as those numbers come in, we will I can report back. But for the most part, right now, it's looking like, yeah, about the vast majority, over 80% of people are still pretty new to Climate Insight. So as I pass over to Eva Jackson to do a bit of an introduction, she'll be sure to give you the overview that you need. And with that, Eva, I'm going to pass it over to you.
First things first, learn how to unmute. Can I hit this end poll that's in the middle of my screen so it's not in my way? Wonderful. Okay. And then I am going to share my screen. I was going to give a bit of an overview of just the pieces that the team is going to be talking about today, but given that finding that so many people are new to Climate Insight, I might just ask for forgiveness and not permission and just share a little bit more background on what we are doing here. So Climate Insight is a platform with information about climate-ready housing and infrastructure. What's unique and I think worth talking about for just a second here is that we have not launched a fully and complete website. The website is meant to evolve and grow and change based on user needs. So sessions like today, sessions like the trainings we've done across the country at other events, and the work of our various advisory groups are meant to influence and really dictate the type of content, the type of features, and the type of functionality that we will be providing on the platform. So you'll note here, we launched our initial product October 2024, and every 6 months we release new functionality and new features with content. So different code standards, tools, options, case studies being released monthly in between those. So we are just after release 3, about 2 weeks off of release 3. Our release 3 hangover has passed, and we're ready to talk about it. And I'm hoping this advance. The main features of the site, and I'll just spend seconds on this, are the geospatial map component, a solutions finder to get people to curated information, and then a more common library where people can use filters. So on the map component, there's layers. The information is sorted at the dissemination area scale. So not quite as small as, 1 by 1 kilometer grid, but not as big as a census subdivision area, the Goldilocks of somewhere in between. And there's data there around climate, socioeconomic factors, and infrastructure. We are adding new layers, so a little bit more about that towards the end of the webinar. But as you can see, the information is located within that dissemination area scale. Interesting feature is that you can layer data sets. So you can layer climate with socioeconomic vulnerability to look at that relationship between increased heat and economic dependency or residential instability, and start to look at that relationship. I'm happy to answer questions on that if that's what you have towards the end. I'm mindful that Adrian wants me to go quick. This is just a screenshot of that solutions finder, where by answering a series of questions, which to you as a user should be quite easy because it's talking about your local context. Are you looking to make improvements above ground or below grade? Are you looking to make retrofit or a new build? Are you looking for information about a single asset or a suite of assets? By answering those types of questions, we're getting through. There's near 300 plus options in here, and we want to get you a list of 7 to go through and not 150, because we all know you don't have time to sift through those types of lists. And then, of course, the library, where this is familiar to everybody. You can just click on certain filters, look across categories, and get to information that way. Remember, in this case, it's not sorted by relevance. It's just sorted through these filters. Some recent changes based on what we were seeing as an emerging need from both municipalities as well as from HICC was the need to focus on the dual crises of housing and climate. And so over the summer, we launched a special content update just on housing. So we partnered with the University of Waterloo to release the numbers that you see here. So 157 specific options for housing. Excuse me. 70 housing related codes and standards, and you can see the other numbers here. Now, getting to the task at hand while I only have 3 minutes left, is the features that are specific to release 3. I'm not going to get into the details because I'm joined by some wonderful colleagues here who can get into the details and do a demo. So what I'll focus on is just a high level overview of what those new release features are. So climate hazard profiles, which this really is a prototype service that's meant to give a snapshot of the likelihood of a climate hazard occurring today and into the future at that dissemination scale. So you can see here one of the climate hazard profiles just posted on the right. You can see the hazards included are extreme heat, flooding, permafrost thaw, and wildfire. And these can be accessed through the map directly or exported as PDFs. So hopefully you can start to see that these exports can help in council reports, committee reports, or just as an information share to your own colleagues. There's a whole list of considerations around these, but I'm going to skip over this and let that be part of our conversation later on because I'm knocking down the barrel of time here. Rapid risk assessment tool. We're really excited about this one. This really is meant to fill a space between, someone reflecting on well, I wonder how the risk is changing and doing it entirely by perception to, on the other side of that spectrum, a full ISO risk assessment of an individual asset or a PIVC assessment of an individual asset. This is meant to be the rapid version that is a bit more robust than just kind of reflecting on previous conditions and how assets have performed in the past. It is meant to be used for localized projects or specific assets, and you can see the asset classes that are available and those same hazards that currently are in there. And I say currently because I'm going to ask you to remember the first thing I said, which was we are evolving. So right now we have these four hazards, but we're looking at how to bring in potentially wind, hail for those of you in the prairies, as well as snow load as possible hazards to then include in the rapid risk assessment. My colleagues will be giving detailed walkthrough of these. So don't worry if you don't fully understand how these work or how the information is gathered. The last thing I wanted to mention, which is another unique feature of Climate Insight, that it is what we internally call a sibling service. It is supported by our partners at Housing Infrastructure and Communities Canada and their help desk, as well as the Canadian Urban Institute and their program, Climate Ready Infrastructure Services, as a place to get one-on-one support and assistance. So if you think about our product really is meant to be, and I'm going to stop sharing so I feel like we can all look at each other. Our product is really meant to be a one-to-many space where many people at the same time can be accessing information that is broader in scope, more general in scope, and giving a range of possibilities. You'll hear later on today from Janessa from HICC how those one-to-one supports can help get into some of the more nuanced conversations that have to happen within one community, as opposed to something that can be done through a website. So a little bit about how we're structuring the webinar today. Josh Kelly and Sherry Young, my colleagues from ICLEI Canada, will do walkthroughs of the new features on Climate Insight. Janessa will have some time to do a conversation about how to get from Climate Insight to more that one-on-one space and how the help desk at HICC can help you do that. And then we will open up for as long of a time of just rapid fire questions as we can get, because that's what we're here to do, to answer your questions about how these tools can apply in your community or which tools are suitable for which types of decisions that you're looking to make. And ultimately, I would love you to tell us, I don't think this is there now, but we'd love it if you could add a module that did this, because remember, we're only halfway through kind of designing the fulsome suite of products. So with that, I'm a couple of minutes late, but I'm going to hand it over, I believe, to Josh first. Josh Kelly, Engineering Director with ICLEI Canada. You will have to unmute now.
Yep, I did. Just moving everything around and it's okay. So I can look at you over here, share my screen on the other side. Yes, everywhere. I got a nod. You can see my screen. Perfect. So this is Climate Insight. As Eva mentioned, it's just the online, it's a website. So free, online, accessible to anybody to support climate ready housing and infrastructure. So I'm going to talk about start off with that hazard profile that Eva mentioned is one of the new features that's just been released. But this is kind of what you get to when you land on the site. The hazard profiles right now are accessible through our geospatial interface through the map. So that's either up here in the top ribbon or just in the Explore Maps area. And this one is letting me shift tabs, right? It's not like you can see that. Okay. So this is the map. I was just playing around here, but you arrive. It's a map of Canada. We have various bits of information, climate layers, around days with maximum temperature, hottest day, these things here for 3 different time periods, baseline, mid-century, end of century. That is also some socioeconomic or vulnerability information in here. The vulnerability index and those things that I've mentioned before. You can look at those together or separately. There is also infrastructure information just to help kind of promote that multi-factor, I guess, decision making where your infrastructure might be vulnerable in areas that are already seeing some, equity deserving or parts of your community. So for the hazard profiles, one thing I guess we don't get is where folks are coming from, but I'm just going to pick on a couple that I've been looking at in the past. So Sudbury is one. You kind of type in where you're from on the map, and it zooms you in, and all of these little areas here you can see are the dissemination areas. It's usually a little or more colorful with that one. But if you click on one of these, it opens up a little dialog box that shows some information and most importantly, view your hazard profile. So this is likelihood data for climate hazards that we've considered on Climate Insight at the moment. Extreme heat, flooding, permafrost thaw, and wildfire. And for 3 time periods as well. So it's got the current period, mid-century, and end of century. And it's a 1 to 5 scale, sort of typical likelihood scoring. So it shows the hazard profile shows kind of how that changes over time for those various hazards, and then maybe which hazards are most likely in your community. So based on this one for Sudbury, we see that, from an extreme heat perspective, that one is getting worse, kind of in line with our understanding and awareness of what's happening in climate in Canada. Flooding as well is an increasing concern over that period to a slightly lesser degree, I guess, or lesser likelihood than the extreme heat. Based on our data, there's no permafrost in Sudbury, so nothing from the likelihood perspective there, and lower on the wildfire. So this is I get prototype data. It's our sort of first kick at the can, and as far as we know, we're the first publicly available data source in Canada that has done this calculation, especially at the dissemination area scale. So it is a work in progress. We have opportunity to add more data sets and enhance this as we go, but right now the different likelihoods for the different hazards, they've got a lot of complex statistical calculations that are happening in behind it, and encourage everybody to take a look at the data and methodology section of the site to kind of answer those questions. And we can certainly talk about some of that later in the Q&A period. So I mean, you can go and jump around. I picked out a few other ones before we started here. Here's one for Atlantic Canada, for Charlottetown. As you might expect, flooding is kind of tops the list in the coastal community. Flooding does consider both coastal and overland riverine flooding, so it is a combination of both that pick up kind of the worst case scenario for those areas. Joliet, Quebec, just another example. See how things are in Quebec, and sort of less lower likelihood on the wildfire as you get into some of those more built up areas. I forgot to track my time here about when I started, so hopefully I'm not too far off. But and up north, Hay River. So this one does have data for permafrost thaw, although according to our data, it doesn't look like there's a lot of change happening on that one, kind of through the time periods. That was Hay River again, and just I'm in BC, so a little bit of the West Coast action. Here's the dissemination area from Gibson. So again, kind of that coastal community is looking at the highest likelihood from the flooding category. And also its sort of urban interface area and increased likelihood of wildfire.
Josh, there's a question in the Q&A to just highlight again how to access the hazard profiles. Do you think you just go back a window to show that?
I sure can. So yeah, from when you get to ClimateInsight.ca, the hazard profiles are most easily accessible from the map. So either the map in the top navigation ribbon or this Explore Maps button from the homepage takes you to our map page here. A few of those things, and then you type in your community. I'm in Prince George, BC, traditional territory of the Kittleya Dene, and that is me. And then click on any one of these areas so you can get a little bit more specific about where you're looking within your community. And my Wi-Fi connection is slowed down for a moment here. Try and reload this, and assuming you have good internet, clicking on one of these dissemination areas will pull up that little dialog window. There, did we get it now?
Either assuming you have good internet or assuming you're not at the same time sharing your screen in a webinar of, many
Yes.
people.
Yeah, so once you click on those, that little dialog box pops up, shows more information about the area that you've selected. And the first thing there is that bold link to access your hazard profile. Hopefully that answers the question. Happy to.
Yeah, there's a comment in the chat about not seeing the layers. I think that's a function of Josh's internet right now. But there, if you look at this one where it's pre-populated and is already in the cache system, you can see the various layers here on the left. And in theory, if the internet
and here's a good example of what happens when you click on it. Oh, now where did we go? Click on this area that you're concerned about, highlights it, and pops up the little dialog box, and then this view hazard profile for this dissemination
and that you could click through a layer by just clicking on hottest day, for example, on the left there.
Yep.
Instead of another parameter. Mm-hmm. It's just the internet's not cooperating with us.
Yeah. Yeah, so happy to kind of get into some of the details on that as we go. There's a little bit of methodology information linked to the data sources if you're interested in more. And then you kind of looked at your hazards. So what do you do next? One of the other things that we've launched for release 2 is some information about the impacts of those hazards. So I will kick it over to Sherry Young for a moment to talk about that.
Thanks, Josh. Yeah, that was perfect. A perfect segue into the impacts cards. And so I'm Sherry Young. I'm the project director here for Climate Insight. And the other piece that feeds into talking about risk and how we're looking at things, you have likelihood, but you need to know what that. So you know how often something's happening. What does that do to your different pieces of infrastructure? So your different types of infrastructure. So I'm going to share my screen here really quickly. We had a power outage here a little earlier, so my Wi-Fi is back up, and hopefully that means that it works. Can everyone see my screen? Yes? Okay, perfect. So I'm going to pick up where Josh left off. Again, there's the map. You can click on your climate hazard profile. I've got one pulled up here already. For the climate profile here. And as Josh showed you, you can scroll right to the bottom to this section, learn about climate impacts. So what do I do next? What kind of impacts will these different hazards have on my infrastructure? So you can access it here at the bottom of your risk assessment, or I'll point out any of your pages on Climate Insight here in this top bar. You can click on Learn and navigate your way through there. From there. Okay, so understanding climate impacts. We focus on a certain number of types of assets in here, and as Eva mentioned earlier, we're an iterative process, so we're adding content all the time. But the main parts of municipally run infrastructure that we've broken it down into are housing and buildings, fleet and public transit, transportation infrastructure, and now this is all. Now transportation infrastructure is all the fixed assets that have to do with how you get somewhere: roads, bridges, transit stops. ferry terminals, things like that. That's what we're focusing on transit infrastructure. If you're looking at mobile infrastructure or ideas and impacts on things that move, this includes generators, transit, buses, trains themselves, and as well as vehicles and park maintenance equipment. Those have a different type of impact. Obviously, you can move them out of the way, and they have motorized equipment. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about fleet and public transit. The other asset types we focus on are green infrastructure, solid waste infrastructure, and water utilities. If you click on any of these, and as Eva mentioned earlier, there's really been a push for housing lately, so I can pull up the impacts on housing card. And what this does, we call these cards. You'll hear us reference different pieces of information as cards because we try to pull all the information onto one page and card it so that which has different information on it. This will summarize the impacts on housing and the different hazards that are addressed on Climate Insight right now, which, as I mentioned earlier, are flooding, extreme heat, wildfire, and permafrost thaw. If you identified in your hazard profile that extreme heat is a big deal in your community, and you're like, oh, what does that do to my buildings? What does that do to my residential buildings? You can see that how extreme heat impacts your structural elements, different structural elements within a building. So we have an image here. It talks about your foundation. It talks about how extreme heat impacts your roof, some other above grade assemblies, if you use concrete or steel, some masonry, and then some of the non-structural elements. How does it impact my decor or my finishings? How does heat impact my electrical and mechanical systems? Then if you're like, oh, what do I do about that? You can actually there's a shortcut here that will bring up a pre-populated search in the library that tells you all the things that are associated with both housing and extreme heat that you could potentially implement into your. Now this is a shortcut. Well, we really, if you need some more information or support on how to streamline that, Eva mentioned earlier the solutions finder. It has questions on how to make these more relevant, so you can answer those questions. But if you just want a quick idea of what's going on and what's associated with those impacts, you can click that little link there, and you will see that there is a link there by each of your different hazard types. So again, extreme heat solutions for buildings. I've clicked on buildings now rather than housing. Flooding solutions, direct impacts for wildfire. And for some of these, we have cost sections here, which we've pulled from our friends over at CatIQ who have pulled together some insurance data. This is pulled together from there. So there are some tables in here that let you know what the annual costs are for commercial properties or that are damaged by wildfire or by flooding. Those are really the metrics that the insurance companies kind of have at their reference. So that's where that comes from. I encourage you to look through these impact cards to really give you an idea of what impacts each of your hazards actually have on your asset infrastructure. And it'll help you inform some of the questions, hopefully, in the next piece, which I'm going to hand back to Josh, since he was instrumental in getting the next tool built up. He's going to be able to explain the rapid risk assessment for you. So remember, you've got these impacts cards in your back pocket as you answer some of the questions in the rapid risk assessment. So I will pass it back to Josh.
Okay, I'll start the whole share thing again. Got it. Okay, so we're back to Climate Insight to look at the rapid risk assessment tool. I guess starting from the beginning again, this is also available as one of these tools to access from the homepage. You could also get to it from those various what would you like to do next buttons at the bottom of the different pages. So yeah, the rapid risk assessment tool, kind of as advertised, meant to be a quick version of an infrastructure-based risk assessment that can kind of get you started along the road instead of investing a lot of resources into something like PyVC. And this one is infrastructure focused as opposed to some other methodologies like the BARC method that ICLEI supports communities with, that looks at more of the whole community risk. So The likelihood information from the hazard profiles is one piece of the risk equation. I think I saw that come up in the chat somewhere along the line. So we're taking the approach of risk equals likelihood times consequence. So we've got those likelihood scores that are coming from the hazard profiles and an opportunity for users to think about and input scores for consequences. So again, this is the first version for the site. We're very much interested in feedback and enhancements as we move forward. So yeah, happy to talk about that stuff down the road. I am going to, kind of stick with the fictitious example that I thought through earlier about a stormwater pipe at a cemetery in Sudbury, because I talked about this one earlier at a different event. So, yeah, you start off, and because it's asset focused, we're looking at what asset are we talking about here. So housing, subdivisions or neighborhoods kind of have a broader focus than a single house or a building. Transportation infrastructure and water, wastewater. So covering your potable sewer and stormwater. Also you can look at kind of new or existing assets for this. For me, I'm looking at the existing. And yeah, before I click next, I'll just highlight a few things because we're going to go through this quickly. There is help information, instructions for completing the risk assessment that goes into kind of more details if you get stuck anywhere along the way. And anywhere kind of throughout the site, if you see these green eyes, it pops up a tooltip with some additional information or definitions around the thing that you're talking about. So we've selected an asset. On to the next part. So this is where you kind of put in some of your project details, name your project, and choose your location. So you can either input this by entering your postal code or through the map. And this is should be that same area in Sudbury that I was clicking around earlier. Yeah, and actually I think if I zoom in a little bit, there's their cemetery located right there. And it does have some stormwater infrastructure located in it. This is also another way to access the hazard profile. A few more steps than going to the map, but same information. Name of community, you need some information about the asset. So we're looking at stormwater pipe that needs an upgrade with some of the future expansions to the cemetery in my fictitious example. And the current piece of infrastructure has about 30 years left of its life. Information, a couple other spots to add information, additional information about the project, and then we get into what hazards we're looking at. So based on the hazard profile, the permafrost thaw was defaulted off because there was not data for that likelihood score. So being set to off. Again, you can kind of toggle these things on and off if you have different information. And for this assessment, I'm not concerned about wildfire as a hazard. So I'm going to toggle that one off. You can always do that later and stick with the kind of flooding and extreme heat. We have the ability to create a profile and save progress and results on Climate Insight. So very much encourage you to do that while you're going through the risk assessment. There's a few more steps in here that you may want to come back to. So the main piece of the risk assessment, we've got our two hazards that we're concerned about. And the first piece is the likelihood score. So this is the same likelihood information that was coming from the hazard profile and is based on the current period and whichever period falls in that nearing end of life for the asset. So because I picked 30 years, 2025 plus 30, 2055 would fall in that mid-century period. You have the ability, and we very much encourage you to think about these likelihood scores and override them if you have more detailed local information. So there is that option as well to kind of make it more local specific. I did see a hand come up. Or maybe I'll get through the rest of this and then we can do the live question. So then the second piece for the risk assessment is the consequence score. So this is very much user driven, suggests that either, and it is better the more variety of, community staff that you're able to bring in to kind of the consequence scoring process and think about some of these things. But we have provided a number of questions under various categories here to help users kind of walk through and kind of center their thinking around what the consequences can be. They fall into these different categories here. And yeah, just as an example, so thinking about our project here around the cemetery stormwater sewer pipe enhancement, what could be the impacts to health and safety? So if this asset is overwhelmed due to a flood, are there concerns for public health and safety? Probably not in this instance. It's not a, yeah, anyways, that was my answer. From an accessibility perspective, yeah, if the cemetery floods, it's not going to be accessible. It's going to make the roads and paths, difficult to traverse. So there's, various questions to kind of help center you along the way, all leading up to this user inputted consequence score. So from a public health and safety perspective, I have selected a medium consequence, that there could be a small number of physical injuries or illnesses as a result of this hazard occurring to this asset. So you can kind of continue on that process through these various sections: local economy and growth, community lifestyle, environment, sustainability, and public administration. This overall score is the maximum from these 5 sections. I thought from a public administration perspective, it would be a medium high, so that's where that number is coming from. You repeat that process, kind of thinking through the likelihood for extreme heat, and then the consequence based on those different categories and questions for all of the hazards that you're concerned about for the assessment. In this case, it's just the flooding and extreme heat. And then we have a summary. So some of those nice project details come out there, and then your risk. So as we mentioned before, this is the likelihood score on a 1 to 5 scale times the consequence score on a 1 to 5 scale, and you come out with these numbers. So it's showing that extreme heat, slightly higher risk than the flooding, and that's likely just because of the likelihood scores. And then breaking down, like within the flooding hazard category, those different sections and kind of where the highest risks lay to help kind of prioritize action. That's the same thing for extreme heat. And this all can come out in a nice PDF, which I forgot to have pre-opened. So yeah, all of that information, the same information as available on the summary, is available in a downloadable document. Plus all of the information that users would have inputted for answering their questions. So you can save this as a record for moving forward. Did forget to mention you can also download the hazard profile as a PDF, but that is there as well. So yeah, very much hoping this is an accessible first step into risk assessment for communities and practitioners that maybe don't have the resources that we said to take on, as we had said, to take on something larger. This can be a good first place to start. So yeah, what's next? So we talked a bit about the impacts cards. Sherry mentioned briefly the solutions finder infrastructure options. I'll just kind of show you quickly what that can look like if you go through the solutions finder. It whittles down the 300 plus infrastructure options that Eva mentioned at the beginning into a curated list. and helps you kind of rank those to what might be most relevant. So some of the things that, I went through and answered the questions following that same project logic, and these are the ones that scored out the best. So probably not relocating the cemetery, but underground storage tanks might help, um, to help control flooding for that asset. So that's kind of the walkthrough of those new services, and an excellent place to get help if you have questions about interpreting the likelihood data or the consequence data or the risk scores or what should I do next is the Climate Help Desk. So I will turn it over to our colleague, Janessa from Housing Infrastructure and Communities Canada to talk about the Climate Help Desk service.
Thank you so much, Josh. I'm just going to share my screen. And I think could I just get a thumbs up quickly if you can see it? Amazing. Okay. So as Eva mentioned earlier, my name is Janessa Doherty. I am joining you from Housing Infrastructure and Communities Canada, where I work with the Climate Help Desk as a senior environmental officer. So thank you so much for having me today to share some of what the Climate Help Desk is doing to support that ClimateInsight.ca platform that we've just learned about. So again, if you recall, I've mentioned that we are a sibling service of the Climate Toolkit for Housing and Infrastructure, and the Climate Help Desk is one of three of those services. So all of the services really have the objective of helping communities to advance their climate-informed infrastructure projects. So communities that have a desire and will to mitigate their risks and to build resilience, our services really support those types of communities, regardless of your size or your location. So, for example, if you are a small rural community like me in Amaranth, Ontario, or maybe you're even a smaller community within a large city like Montreal or Vancouver, then one of our services definitely has a place to help you with your infrastructure needs. So I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into what exactly the Climate Help Desk does to support the other sibling services, the CRIS service and the ClimateInsight.ca platform. And this has been mentioned by a lot of the different speakers today, but I think one of the greatest features of our service is the fact that you can speak directly with a climate expert. So you can see on the left-hand side of the screen here, there are three different mediums of choice that you can contact us through, either by web form or by phone or by email. And of course, you can contact us in the language of your choice, either French or English. And in response to an inquiry that you send to us, someone from our help desk team will get back to you with a tailored response. And what I mean by tailored response is that gone are the days where you will get that rote response that everyone gets. Instead, you can ask the Climate Help Desk a question, and what we'll do behind the scenes is all of the work for you. We will do all the research. We will look at all of the resources. We will look at all of the tools and the case studies, and we will curate them for you to answer your question to your specific inquiry for your specific project, and find the tools and resources that are most suitable for your local context. And just a side note, that the greatest thing about that too is that you'll get that response within 5 days because that is our service standard. So you will no longer be waiting 2 weeks or 3 weeks or more for that response, because we understand that your climate needs are often immediate, and so we try and provide you with an immediate response. So some of the advice and guidance that you will find from us is just really sector best practice for incorporating those low carbon and climate resilient measures into your project. We're finding tools and resources that are most suitable to the infrastructure that is the subject of your particular inquiry. But also, happily, we provide guidance on meeting climate requirements for funding programs, because we know that funding programs are also very important to you. And you will be happy to know that clients who seek our guidance when they are applying for funding programs are typically more successful than clients who don't. So that is your sign right there to get in touch with us if you have questions related to any open intakes for funding. So I bet you're wondering now, what the heck does this have to do with the ClimateInsight.ca platform? So I am going to tell you a little bit more about how the Climate Help Desk is supporting questions that you might find as you are navigating that platform. So Josh gave us some fantastic information about that rapid risk assessment tool, as well as the hazard profiles for different communities. And Sherry also gave us some fantastic information about the library and all of those tool cards that you can find. So perhaps when you are navigating that site, you might want a little bit more information about, well, what the heck does this hazard profile mean? How do I interpret it? I need help. Well, that's where you come to the Climate Help Desk. Or maybe you're answering those questions that Josh had highlighted earlier about through the rapid risk assessment tool about your community or your asset, and you get stuck on one and you think, I'm a little confused and I'm not quite sure how to answer this question, or I'm not quite sure, how to actually navigate this tool. Well, again, that's where you can come to the Climate Help Desk to help you walk through those things. And just as I mentioned, we understand that sometimes navigating the Internet of Things, including the ClimateInsight.ca platform, could potentially land you with 150 tools that Eva mentioned earlier. We hope that it doesn't, because you'll be answering some pretty specific questions that ICLEI has just done a fantastic job to help filter those tools for you. But if such a situation arises and you land yourself with a bunch of different tools and resources and you're not quite sure which ones are most suitable for you, well, the Climate Help Desk can really help you narrow down those options and help interpret even the results that are displayed on that Climate Insights map, or the results that you find through your rapid risk assessment tool. Needless to say that we are really here for you to help make sure that the tools that you're using and the resources that you're navigating are as easy to navigate as possible. And of course, those are not the only things that we do. We do a lot of additional things as well, and answer other questions that are related to any of your climate or infrastructure needs. So you will also be happy to know that the Climate Help Desk is just a click away while you are in your journey on the ClimateInsight.ca platform at any time. Should you find yourself having a question that you want answered immediately, you need only go to the top of the site where you will find a handy dandy little services tab, and you can click on that tab and it will, so this one right here, and then you'll be able to click on the button that says ask a question, and you will come directly to the Climate Help Desk. So that's very quick and dirty what the Climate Help Desk does, hopefully in 6 minutes or less. But here are details again. If you have any questions at all about anything that we discussed today, or maybe you have a question, but you haven't really formed the full question yet. You don't really know what your climate question is or what your climate inquiry or infrastructure inquiry is. Well, you can still get in touch with us and we can help you think about what's important to your community and what resources would be most suitable for you. So thank you very much. Feel free to ask any questions in the chat box.
Thank you so much. Thanks to all of the panelists. That was tons of information. So I really appreciate how everyone was able to kind of succinctly, yeah, get everything out in as little time as possible to leave us this next 30 minutes or so, a little more to ask questions. So we collected some questions before the webinar as well. Many of you asked questions as you registered, and I will suggest starting there because I believe all the questions that have been asked in the chat have been answered live by Eva, which is great. If there's any questions that you asked that we've missed, please don't hesitate to re-up them. I think because there was so much content there, before jumping into the questions, I might just suggest that I do a really quick two-sentence recap. And then also, Janessa, I would ask if you don't mind, just stop sharing your screen so that folks can see our faces big and beautiful. So, as a quick recap, ClimateInsight.ca is a free website, a free online platform that takes vetted expert data and also works with experts to vet it. So, data, resources, tools, and brings them all together to be the one go-to place that communities from across Canada can go to access resources, data, information, support to try to build low carbon resilient housing and infrastructure. And once you've found whatever resources, tools you need on Climate Insight, if you need additional kind of one-to-one support in getting those things implemented, the Climate Help Desk is a sibling service that can provide you with free one-on-one support to do that. That's very broad strokes, an overview of what we talked about today. And now I think that I would like to start by throwing it to a question that we received in the registration form that I think is very apt, which is, a lot of these new tools that and new features that came out recently are about risk assessment. Are there any supports in Climate Insight to help folks go from risk assessment to adaptation planning? So from assessment to implementation, and what might that journey look like if someone's using Climate Insight to go all along that journey? And I think, Josh, you mentioned this a little bit when you were talking a bit about how the solutions finder comes into play at the end. So I might throw to you first.
Sure. Um, yes, so we do certainly have tools to help kind of go from that planning to implementation process. And I think the solutions finder is probably the best example of that. So that was one of the key features of Climate Insight to, as Janessa said, to kind of help weed through the potentially overwhelming number of things and like get over the where do I start. So if you have completed a risk assessment or if you use the rapid risk assessment tool on Climate Insight, the Solutions Finder is an excellent next step. So through that process, I flashed up the results quickly, but it's a sort of guided decision tree. So you go through and answer a series of questions about, which asset you're looking at, what hazard you're concerned about, or if it's, I guess, not adaptation related, there also is mitigation options to look at from a climate action perspective. So some details about the asset, the site, and it whittles down that list of 300 plus infrastructure interventions to a manageable place to start. And you can answer a few more questions to kind of get that ranking that I flashed up at the end. So I think the process or the journey there is once you complete your risk assessment and you've identified kind of, yeah, I guess in the case of the Climate Insight tool, which hazard is going to be most impactful or puts your infrastructure most at risk, you can follow through in the solutions finder to look at infrastructure interventions to reduce your risk or mitigate the risk from that hazard. So yeah, I encourage you to kind of go through and follow that journey. And it looks like Eva's going to add something.
Well, the only other thing I'd add was one of the pieces that we hadn't talked about is in that solutions finder, if you're not ready to go down that pathway of identifying individual infrastructure options to either reduce emissions or adapt, there's another pathway you can take that says, I need to establish a plan. And you can answer a different set of questions. We love asking you questions. Answer a different set of questions to get pointed to a tool or at least a short list of tools to look into to develop an adaptation plan or an adaptation strategy or a mitigation plan or a plan for a specific asset, so your buildings. I think that the interesting piece about having these sibling services is that you can then take that information, reach out to the help desk and say, okay, I think I'd like to use this. How do I get started? How do I find someone who's working in this space? How do I do you have case studies or examples of people who have used this tool? Like, I think, Janessa, it's fair to say, like, there's no question that's too small or too complicated. You folks, if you don't have the answer, will help point and direct to subject matter experts who might have that answer. And so I think that's what's really neat, is that you can take a product or take a short list of products that are in the tool, and then you still have access to a real person and not just an automated response, just as you were saying. So I think, Josh, you're right. You can go from hazard to solution, but if you want to do a formal planning effort, there are also different tools embedded that can help you down that pathway.
I might just also add that there are so many wonderful tools on the ClimateInsight.ca platform, but there might be a tool that you're looking for or a resource or document and you can't find it on ClimateInsight.ca. And you're wondering, well, what is the answer to my question? And that's another way that you can reach out to the Climate Help Desk to say, hey, I searched through ClimateInsight.ca. I wasn't able to find a tool that's specific for my community. And so, do you have any recommendations or suggestions? And the Climate Help Desk can help you work through what is available to your specific community and your adaptation planning. We don't anticipate that you won't find it on climateinsight.ca, but just in case that situation arises.
Sherry, it looked like you wanted to add something. Feel free before I...
I was just going to say, Eva pointed out earlier that Climate Insight is iterative, so it might not be there yet, which is where Climate Help Desk, if you have a tool or something like that that you haven't, that can support your work, or if Climate Help Desk can support some of that, then we have an ongoing relationship with them, and they can let us know also that there's this new tool or there's something about a gap, so we can make sure that the next time somebody's looking for something, we can include it in our content uploads. So it's very much a sibling service and back and forth. So to mutual support. So.
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks very much for the question and for your thoughtful answers. Another question that was sent in advance that is a little bit more than just a yes, no, I think could it be expanded upon, is does this tool work for First Nation communities? The answer simply is yes, but I'm wondering if maybe some folks from Climate Insight can speak a little bit more to how Climate Insight was designed to be applicable to a large number of communities, municipalities, towns, and First Nations.
I'll start and I'll ask friends to jump in. One of the things when we were designing the rapid risk assessment tool, and hopefully this came through to the group as Josh was showing it, was the questions are meant to be answered by somebody who understands the local context and how the local asset that is being evaluated currently functions. And so this really relies on experiential knowledge as much as it relies on data. One has to know that, oh, the pipe we have here always, the demand exceeds the capacity of the pipe. Or we know that this area of roadway always floods. So if we build next to it. And that I think is a good example of how the content is really for any type of community, First Nations, small, rural, remote, northern, where somebody working thousands of miles away may not have that answer. So I'm using the example of the rapid risk assessment tool, but the same would be true for the solutions finder. The person who is sitting in that community will be able to very easily answer those questions. We've actually noticed this when we are doing testing with people who don't work in a community. It was hard for them to answer those questions because they don't own or operate an asset day to day and know how it functions. So that local knowledge, I think, is really crucial. And I think that often comes in abundance, more so in those rural, remote communities where those of us not in them may not understand how infrastructure is currently functioning. The other piece is, I spoke quickly about the various tools that exist. There are some tools that are profiled through Climate Insight that are exclusively for First Nations communities and designed for First Nations communities, either on reserve or in some cases even urban Indigenous populations. So I think there is a lot of content in there, but that's one of the things we're striving to do better. I think, we've built the system But we need, if you build it, they don't necessarily come. We have to go to where people are. So Sherry's been to a number of Assembly First Nations events to learn more and understand more about how we can make the site more accessible and more usable. So this is a constant work in progress. And if there are ideas of how to do this better, or suggestions of content and examples and case studies and resources we can profile, connect into, or even develop new tools, we would love that. So if that's a conversation the question asker is wanting to have or willing to have, we would very much value that and would love for them to get in touch.
Excellent. And I actually think that dovetails really well into another question that was asked. So I might just ask that one and allow folks to answer both at once if you'd like, which is someone was asking who the target audience is for the rapid risk assessment tool. And also if there's any plans to provide smaller communities who lack capacity to help interpret the results that they get from that risk assessment tool. So who's the audience and how can we support those who might not know how to interpret the results?
I can jump here. Well, the audience generally for Climate Insight from the start has been for those municipalities that do not have, it's just to increase capacity in those municipalities that don't, or in those local communities that don't necessarily have the staff in-house. So this isn't targeted for communities over 1 million people with a whole climate change staff. This is targeted for your communities under 100,000 that may have somebody doing climate work off the side of their desk, and they don't necessarily have all of that information right at their fingertips. Now, the rapid risk assessment requires a bit more local knowledge and a bit more familiarity with what's going on with your project and things like that. So maybe it's being compiled by your asset management specialist who knows about the asset but doesn't necessarily know about the impacts of climate on your project or things like that. And we really encourage, as Josh said earlier, to make sure that the person who's filling out that rapid risk assessment talks to the people in their community in the administration to get some of that local knowledge to feed into that the answers for the consequence questions. So you get a really clear picture of what both your likelihood, whether your likelihood is aligned with what we get in our national database and as well as the local consequences, so that you get a good picture of your risk. Now, some of those questions some of those people might be if you're not the asset management person, maybe talk to them. Some of your finance people, some of the people who've been around, maybe your disaster response people, your emergency management people might be able to help you with some of that information, just for that oral history on what's happening in there. You might have a climate specialist or a park specialist that knows what some of those consequences are, and some of your planning specialists or your social people, the people looking after your social programs who see some of those impacts on your communities. Don't forget your operations staff, your transportation people. We really encourage a multidisciplinary approach to gather that information.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Sherry. There's most of the other questions that have come through, I have to say, are quite specific. They're about specific data questions. There's been quite a few questions about flood risk, though, including quite specific ones about things like surface permeability. But I'm wondering if maybe, given that we've gotten a few questions about flood risk, if someone might want to speak a little bit to, generally speaking, what some of our kind of thematic content uploads are like and what kind of resources are there. So I know we are planning an upload soon, I believe, with flood resources. And maybe we can speak a little bit to what those monthly content uploads look like.
Sure. We've mentioned this a few times. The content is updated, I think about 8 months a year, not including the months we're doing big releases to update functionality and tools. But we are constantly updating our content on the site. So we currently, and I just quickly looked at the library and clicked off flooding. We currently have 121 infrastructure options related to flooding, 49 case studies, and 60 code standards and guidelines, as well as 63 tools that incorporate some of the parameters around flooding. So we know that flooding is a big deal, especially in places on the coastline, in Ontario and Quebec. Those are big deals. And I mean, I I'm in Alberta. We've had a couple floods over here too. So flooding is something that touches everybody, and so we have a lot of content on there right now. Josh can maybe touch on some of the methodology and things on the RRA to how that flooding is incorporated into that more intensely. But those content uploads, you'll see if you don't see a tool there or a case study that applies to you right now, keep watching. We will have a big flooding upload coming in December after our November equity themed one. So if you don't see something there yet, you can either call the help desk or you can take a look in January or in December after our upload.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. And Janessa, I see that you are typing a bit of an answer in real time to one of the questions that came through the Q&A. I wonder if you would be open to just answering it in real time. So I will read out the question and then I might ask you to hop in. So the question that we received is, what practical barriers might government staff or private developers face when applying the technical guidance from Climate Insight in real-world development applications? Are the platform's resources, such as the standards, geospatial data, and risk assessments, directly translatable into requirements for planning submissions or permit processes?
Thanks, Adrian. So yeah, I was just about to highlight some of the ways that the tools that are on the ClimateInsight.ca platform can be transferable to some of HICC's programs, particularly funding programs. Through those funding programs, we have actually identified some of the challenges that developers face, like development charges, and that municipalities face as well in terms of climate requirements or reporting requirements for risk assessments when undertaking particular infrastructure projects. And so in these two specific challenges, the great thing is that the rapid risk assessment that was just described today, as well as the hazard profiles, can be used for some funding programs. And I'm thinking specifically of the current intake that we have open for Canada Housing and Infrastructure Fund, or CHIF. Some participants on the meeting today might be in provinces with those open intakes. So that rapid risk assessment tool that Josh described can actually be used for successful applicants when they have to identify their risks to their particular project. So that is the one transferable option for a tool that is currently existing on the ClimateInsight.ca platform. But in addition, another requirement when you are applying for some programs is that you identify or you attest to undertaking adaptation and mitigation actions once you have identified specific risks to your project. And so that's where we can look at that fabulous tool library that Sherry showed us that can show you the mitigation and risk mitigation and adaptation action. So that's another transferable tool or resource that's on the ClimateInsight.ca platform that can be used by municipalities or communities that are applying for funding programs. So I don't know if that answers part of your question, Jose, but I'm happy to chat more about that if you're thinking about other ways that tools on the ClimateInsight.ca platform could support particular HICC programs and funding programs in particular.
And just to add from my used to work for a municipality, and I think Jose it probably depends on the requirements of the community that you're working in. If outputs from Climate Insight are directly transferable into submissions or permits. It would very much depend on the community requirements, what they need, and sort of what standards they look at for various inputs to their permitting and planning submissions. So that's maybe a tough one to answer specifically, depending on which community you're in and what their requirements.
Great. Thank you both very much. Josh, I might put you on the spot to ask one more question. You mentioned when you're going through the hazard profiles that there's more details you can provide about some methodology and data. A question came in through the Q&A asking about where we get some of the likelihood scores. I know that's a
Okay.
bit dense, but do you think you could maybe give us a little bit, at least point us to where people can find more information about the data and the methodology that goes into making those likelihood
Sure.
scores?
Um, okay, yes, I'm off mute. So we do have an entire sort of data sources and methodology section on Climate Insight. It's accessible, I guess, in the footer banner, data sources and methodologies. It outlines some of those processes for the various tools and the map data, the hazard profile, that sort of thing. So from the I guess, data source perspective, we list all of the different data sources for the various hazards. They all have different climate data as an input from climatedata.ca, similar to our climate data on the map. Most of them have additional data sets sort of for historical hazard occurrences. And for example, like the flooding data has susceptibility indices that were prepared by NRCan. Permafrost relies on stuff like ground ice, sort of ground cover, permafrost condition, um, that type of information. There, I would suggest that now I'm trying to remember where we put this. There is, right, in the rapid risk assessment section, the scores, oh, they're in there somewhere. There are like three different versions, I guess, of trying to explain the likelihood scores and how they were calculated. So it's more than just like counting the change in the like number of days above 30 degrees, for example. So there's a lot of really heavy statistics that went in to the background of that. So we've endeavored to distill that down in a couple of different places. There's a sort of few sentence, hopefully easily to understand and digest summary that you can see on the hazard profile. So if you go to one of the hazard profiles and once you scroll down past the scores, there's actually a few sentences about how each one of the hazards was calculated. Then there is kind of a two-pager that's gets into a little bit more detail, kind of combining that quick couple of sentences with the data sources and getting into a little bit more detail. And then if you really want to get into it, there's a full kind of hopefully repeatable methodology document that's like 6 to 8 pages for each hazard with all the data sources and all the sort of statistics and methodology behind it for each of the hazards. Um, yeah, if this was sort of specifically around the wildfire likelihood one, that likelihood information, the methodology around the likelihood information is pending. It will be posted to the site shortly. Um, but yes, in general, data sources and methodology is an excellent place to start if you have questions about how we arrived at any of the numbers.
Thanks very much, Josh. And I hope that just knowing that we are putting out what should be replicable methodology documents also just provides some comfort and reassurance that everything on the platform really is, you know, expert curated and vetted and really meant to be, um, yeah, to be an expert tool. Um, Quite soon, I'm going to pass over to Eva to talk a bit about what's coming up next, and I think that that can also answer one of the questions in the Q&A about what some updates are that are coming soon. But because that will be sort of our last question, I just wanted to give one last opportunity if anyone else has a question to either put it in the chat or the Q&A or to raise your hand before we start looking ahead to what's coming up next.
I put it in the chat and I just remembered kind of while we were answering questions that someone did have a hand up during part of my demo and I wanted to make sure that if that person is still here and their question has not been answered, welcome to put your hand up again
I think there
or
was a reference that it was an accidental click.
oh, okay.
All right. Well, then, if any further questions come up, I will just stick our Climate Insight email address into the chat. But otherwise, Eva, would you like to? You've just earned an extra 5 minutes. If you would like to either review anything or maybe give us a bit of a preview of what's coming. And then after that, I will just do a very quick wrap up.
A minute given is a minute taken in my book, so I will use it. I'm not one to give back people 4 minutes. I will just bring up, and I'm hoping it's shared, Adrian. Thank you. The what's next, because there is a question in the Q&A that I would like to talk about that is very much linked to this. So I thought I would give a teaser. As you saw in my first slide in that timeline, we have our every 6 months larger releases, and in between those content updates. So things we're working on in both content updates and releases. In November, we will be launching an energy poverty layer on the geospatial map. So you'll be able to look at any dissemination area in Canada and look at it, the rate of energy poverty within that dissemination area. This brings together a number of specific metrics from Statistics Canada, and compiles them into one layer reflecting energy poverty. We were able to do this with in partnership and with support from Efficiency Canada. So we're excited to launch that I think it'll be mid-November, but again, if you sign up to on the site to our newsletter, you'll be able to access that. That specialty monthly content that Sherry was talking about, we've got a monthly update for flooding, another round equity between now and March 2026. And these are some of the new tools that we are thinking about now. So we're building an interactive calculator on costs for climate-ready housing or infrastructure at build, and then what the occupant savings or the avoided costs might be of that. We know people get often questioned about, well, it's more expensive to build a climate-ready home than it is to just build kind of a standard traditional home. Why would I take that on? So we want to give somebody the data around, if you use better insulation, if you use better windows to reduce, heat loss, what are the occupant savings? We're also working with Sustainable Solutions Group and exploring how to incorporate their land use impact calculator within Climate Insight. I note there was a question earlier about APIs, and I believe the question was related to taking data from Climate Insight into another tool. We've been looking at it the other way. How can we build an API from existing tools with Climate Insight? So that's worth exploring. The question I wanted to touch on that was in the Q&A was, where can people find these monthly content updates? And the best way to do that is actually through our newsletter, where we specify what the new content is, whether they're new codes and standards, whether they're new options, as we add to all elements of the site. So it's hard to sort of point to what's new in that there are many new features. So I really would encourage you to do that as well. And the other thing I'd encourage is to really use the login and save feature. So you can, you saw when Josh was sharing his screen, he had 7 tabs open for different hazard profiles or different options cards. You can save all those and have your own personal library within that feature. So I think that's also a good way to keep tabs of the new things you find. It's not necessarily a new site every day, but it could be a new site to you every day, depending on what pathway you took. So I think it's a really great way to save all that. And Adrian, I have this slide in here, and I don't know whether you wanted me to share it, but I will say that this is our ask of people to stay connected. Hopefully you're encouraged to visit the site, both in English and or French, to subscribe to that newsletter, LinkedIn, we also put a lot of snippets about the exact new content, and a lot of the new video tutorials that our team records are accessible first through LinkedIn and then through the site. So that could be an interesting place if you want to stay tuned. And then, of course, to provide us feedback. Hopefully, that message came through loud and clear around we're looking to iterate. There was a great conversation happening in the chat about considering to put seismic information into the map as well as into the rapid risk assessment tool. Our plans hadn't gone there, but if there's enough requests to do that, that is something that we're happy to bring to our governance committees and have them weigh in on that. They are our North Star to some degree. Well, I suppose no, the municipal users and community users are our North Star, but they help vet us to get there. So I'll leave this up for a second more. Adrian, I don't know if you have any more polls and things up your sleeve.
Yeah, we have one last poll. We just want to get a bit of a sense of whether this training provided you with additional information. And so we're going to actually relaunch essentially the same poll that we launched earlier to get an idea of how comfortable you feel now, how familiar you feel with Climate Insight after this webinar, and also whether you expect or hope to use Climate Insight more after this webinar. And we're very grateful for any input that you provide. So thank you so much. I see we already have about 10 folks who have participated and many more coming in. So we really appreciate that. And while you're answering that poll, just a reminder that you can email us at any time with additional questions. We host kind of bigger webinar trainings like this that are a bit more all-encompassing every so often, but we also host quite a few more specific trainings. So we go to events all over the country where you can book 15 minutes to just sit down with us and walk through how you want to use Climate Insight. Our inbox is always open if you want to ask more specific questions or request an online walkthrough that looks like that. So it's an incredibly lucky thing to be building a platform that we get to update every month and that we get to update with even big functionality changes multiple times a year because it means that your feedback can be, really materially put into place and make sure that this is a very user-driven platform. So we
Just one other
appreciate,
thing I'll
yeah.
add, if you're one of those events that Josh and myself will be at soon, and Janessa actually, is the National Water Wastewater Conference happening in Victoria. So if you'd like to reach out to your colleagues in the water and wastewater services divisions in your municipalities, that's a great way to let them know to come by our exhibit there or to our sessions. There are two of them to learn more about Climate Insight from a water, wastewater perspective and not this generalist session that we're doing now. So we'd encourage you to reach out to your colleagues who may be attending that to say, keep an eye out and come by that space. And the last thing, Adrian, I'll say, because you've given me one more second,
Yeah.
is just to reiterate that, Climate Insight in part is funded through the Government of Canada, but it's really delivered by ICLEI Canada with the direct support of Housing Infrastructure and Communities Canada. And again, that sibling relationship is really real. And I think we feed on each other. We don't quarrel like siblings do. We just get along. So maybe we're more cousins because cousins always get along. Anyway, just to iterate that we're lucky to have that relationship to be able to iterate based on kind of new information coming from the federal government and get that directly to municipal users through Climate Insight.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, then I will propose that we let you all go with an extra 5 minutes in your day. A webinar that ends 5 minutes early is always a nice thing. But our inbox is always open, and we thank you so much for all of your questions and your active participation in the chat. And we hope to be in touch. So thank you to everyone who's joined.